In 1203, a teenage prince disappeared at Rouen, carrying a claim to territories that made him a threat to the English crown. Arthur of Brittany had been captured during a brutal struggle for power, and then, suddenly, the historical record goes dark. The strangest part is not that Arthur vanished. It is that the surviving sources never agree on what happened next. One account suggests murder, another leaves the matter unresolved. And after more than 8 centuries, the evidence still cannot tell us which version is true. But Arthur is only the first case. The deeper we go, the more often we encounter the same disturbing pattern. A final sighting, a sudden silence, and a story that ends before the truth can be recorded. Tonight, we follow 10 such cases, each one leaving behind a different kind of mystery. Let's start with the boy who vanished at Rouen. The castle of Rouen stands today only in fragments. A tower here, a foundation stone there, swallowed centuries ago by the growing city around it. But in the early spring of 1203, it was one of the most heavily guarded fortresses in the Angevin world, the administrative heart of Normandy, and, for a few short weeks, a prison. Somewhere within its walls, a 16-year-old boy who had once been recognized as the rightful heir to the throne of England was held under lock and key. He would never be seen again. His name was Arthur, Duke of Brittany, and his disappearance remains one of the most consequential unsolved mysteries of the medieval world. A case with a prime suspect, a plausible motive, and no body ever produced. Let us begin with what the records allow us to establish. Arthur was born in 1187, the posthumous son of Geoffrey, Duke of Brittany, who was himself the third surviving son of King Henry II of England. This made Arthur a nephew of King Richard the Lionheart, and, crucially, a rival claimant to 2 men who wanted the English throne for themselves. When Richard died in 1199 without a legitimate child, the succession was, by the standards of primogeniture common in parts of the continent, genuinely ambiguous. Arthur, as the son of an elder brother, had a reasonable claim. So did John, Richard's younger brother, who moved quickly and decisively to have himself crowned in England, while Arthur, still a child of 12, was in Brittany and France, backed by King Philip II of France, who saw in the boy a useful instrument against English power on the continent. For 4 years, Arthur existed as a political pawn and a genuine threat, sometimes in French custody, sometimes leading his own forces, sometimes negotiating, sometimes fighting. The conflict came to a head in the summer of 1202 near the town of Mirbeau, where Arthur, then 15, laid siege to a castle in which his own grandmother, the formidable Eleanor of Aquitaine, had taken refuge. It was a bold move and a fatal miscalculation. John marched his forces with unusual speed, caught Arthur's army by surprise, and captured the young duke along with a number of his key supporters. From that point, the documented trail begins to thin. Arthur was initially imprisoned at Falaise, in Normandy, under the custody of a nobleman named Hubert de Burgh. According to the chronicler Ralph of Coggeshall, writing not long after the events, John gave orders that Arthur be blinded and castrated, a common medieval method of permanently disqualifying a rival from rule without the direct stain of killing him outright. Hubert de Burgh, the chronicler claims, could not bring himself to carry out the order, and instead let it be rumored that Arthur had died of natural causes, hoping to spare the boy while quietly protecting himself from John's wrath. When the ruse provoked public outrage in Brittany rather than acceptance, Hubert supposedly revealed that Arthur was, in fact, still alive. It is a remarkable story, and it may even be true in part. But it is also where reliable history begins to blur into something closer to rumor passed between monasteries, recorded by men who were not present and who had every reason, given the political climate, to shape the narrative one way or another. What we do know with more confidence is that Arthur was transferred from Falaise to Rouen sometime in early 1203, placed under close guard, and that after that transfer, no verified sighting of him exists in any surviving record. he simply stops appearing in the documentary evidence. For a duke, a claimant to the English crown, a young man whose movements had been tracked and discussed across 2 kingdoms for years. That silence is, in itself, extraordinary. So what happened inside Rouen? The most widely repeated account comes from the Margam Annals, a chronicle compiled at a Welsh abbey with connections to Anglo-Norman nobility. It states plainly that on the Thursday before Easter in 1203, King John, after dinner and heavily drunk, killed Arthur with his own hands, tied a heavy stone to the body, and threw it into the Seine, where it was later recovered by a fisherman and secretly buried at the priory of Bec. It is a vivid, almost cinematic account, precise in its details, confident in its accusation. And that precision is exactly what should give a careful investigator pause. Chroniclers writing at a remove from events, particularly those working within monastic institutions that had their own political sympathies, were not above constructing plausible, dramatic narratives to fill gaps that reality had left open. Did the monks at Margam know something the rest of Europe did not? Or did they simply give shape to the suspicion that was already spreading like smoke through the courts of France and England? Because suspicion is, ultimately, all that survives. No body was ever formally identified. No trial was held, a fact that is itself telling, since John, whatever his flaws, was generally careful to seek some legal or procedural cover for his actions. There is no confession, no order in his own hand, no contemporary eyewitness testimony that has come down to us directly. What we have is silence from the accused, a disappearance that fits a motive almost too neatly, and chronicles written after the fact by men who had reason to believe the worst of a king already widely disliked. It is worth pausing here to consider what John stood to gain. With Arthur alive, John's hold on Normandy and his broader continental territories remained perpetually contested, a rallying point for every noble in Brittany and Anjou who preferred not to answer to an English king. With Arthur dead, that particular threat evaporated, and the political consequences of the disappearance were immediate and severe. King Philip of France used Arthur's vanishing as pretext to summon John to the French court to answer for the treatment of his prisoner. John, unsurprisingly, refused to appear. Philip's court then declared John's continental territories forfeit, a judgment that set in motion the slow, grinding loss of Normandy itself within the following year. In other words, whether or not John personally killed his nephew, the disappearance of Arthur was, politically, one of the most catastrophic events of his entire reign. It is difficult to imagine a rational calculation in which the murder served John's interests once the fallout is considered. And yet chroniclers, then and since, have rarely credited John with rational calculation where his own family was concerned. There are other, quieter threads that historians still turn over. Some records suggest Arthur may have been moved between more than one location in his final months, raising the question of exactly where, geographically, his fate was sealed. Falaise, or Rouen, or somewhere between the two. Some later, less reliable accounts claim sightings or rumors of Arthur's survival persisting for years afterward, whispers among Breton nobility unwilling to accept that their duke was truly gone, the kind of folk resistance to an inconvenient death that echoes forward through history in the stories told about other vanished royals. None of these threads amount to evidence, but they speak to something real, an unresolved case, in its own time, not only for us looking back 8 centuries later, but for the people who lived through it and simply did not know. What would we need to finally close this file? A body, properly identified, would help. Yet Normandy in 1203 kept no forensic records, and 8 centuries of riverbed silt and shifting priory grounds have likely erased whatever remains might once have been recoverable. A confession would help, but confessions of murdered royal relatives were not the currency of medieval kingship. Silence was. So the question remains essentially where the chroniclers left it. Did John of England murder his nephew and rival with his own hands on a spring night in Rouen, as the Margam Annals insist? Or did Arthur die some other way? An accident during a failed escape attempt, perhaps, or an execution ordered but carried out by another's hand, its details later exaggerated into a more damning and dramatic tale. We are left, as investigators so often are with medieval mysteries, standing at the edge of what the surviving documents can tell us, aware that somewhere beyond that edge lies an answer that may never surface. A castle wall in Rouen, long since absorbed into later construction, may be the last physical witness to whatever truly happened inside it. It has kept its silence for over 800 years. There is no reason yet to think it intends to break it. 2 centuries before a Scaliger lord fell ill in the flush of triumph, and more than 200 years before a Hungarian prince was strangled behind a bolted door, another sudden death had already taught Europe's ruling families just how easily an arrow, a hunt, and a stretch of ancient woodland could rearrange the fate of a kingdom. The place is the New Forest, in the south of England, a vast expanse of woodland and heath stretching across Hampshire, deliberately preserved as royal hunting ground since the reign of William the Conqueror. Even today, walking among its oaks and open clearings, there is something faintly unsettling about the quiet. Deer still move through the undergrowth. And somewhere within that forest, near a spot long marked by a weathered iron memorial known as the Rufus Stone, a king of England died on the afternoon of August 2nd, 1100, struck through the chest by an arrow while hunting with a small party of nobles, in circumstances that remain, more than 9 centuries later, stubbornly, maddeningly unresolved. The king was William II, called Rufus, the Red, for his ruddy complexion or his flame-colored hair, depending on which chronicler you believe. He was the 3rd son of William the Conqueror, and by 1100 had ruled England for 13 turbulent years. A soldier king, forceful and often ruthless, deeply unpopular with the church for his aggressive taxation of ecclesiastical lands, and surrounded, as most medieval kings were, by relatives and nobles whose loyalty was never quite as absolute as it appeared at court. On that August afternoon, William Rufus rode into the New Forest with a hunting party that included, among others, his younger brother Henry, and a nobleman named Walter Tyrrell, Lord of Poix, a skilled huntsman by reputation, and, as it happened, married to a member of the powerful Clare family, one of the most influential noble houses in Anglo-Norman England. As dusk approached, the party split up to pursue deer through the forest's clearings, each hunter positioned at a different vantage point, waiting for game to be driven toward them. What happened next has come down to us in several versions, none of them fully consistent, all of them filtered through chroniclers writing years, sometimes decades, after the fact, with their own reasons to shape the story one way or another. The most widely repeated account holds that Walter Tyrrell, aiming at a stag that crossed his line of sight, loosed an arrow that struck a tree, deflected, and pierced William Rufus through the chest as the king stood nearby, watching the same animal. William reportedly said nothing, made no cry, but simply broke off the arrow shaft protruding from his body and collapsed, dying almost instantly. Tyrrell, according to this version, panicked at the sight of the king lying dead, understanding, perhaps better than anyone else present, exactly how such a moment would be interpreted, and fled the scene immediately, riding hard for the coast and escaping across the Channel to France before anyone could detain him. He would never return to England and would deny for the rest of his life that he had fired the fatal shot at all. And here the story takes its first genuinely strange turn. William Rufus's body was not carried back to a royal residence with the ceremony one might expect for a fallen king. Instead, it was left where it fell for some time, then transported to Winchester Cathedral on a simple cart by a group of local charcoal burners, common forest laborers, while the nobles who had been hunting alongside him scattered in every direction. Not to organize a search for the culprit, not to secure the body with appropriate honor, but, chroniclers tell us, to ride as fast as their horses could carry them toward Winchester, where the royal treasury was kept. Because riding hardest and fastest of all was the king's own brother, Henry, while William Rufus's corpse still lay abandoned in the forest. Henry was already at Winchester, securing the treasury by nightfall. Within 3 days, he had been crowned King Henry I of England at Westminster Abbey. an almost impossibly swift transition of power, particularly given that Henry was not the obvious heir. The eldest of the conqueror's surviving sons, Robert Curthose, Duke of Normandy, held a stronger dynastic claim and was, at the moment of William's death, on his way home from the First Crusade, his absence from English soil at the precise moment the throne became vacant proving, for Henry, extraordinarily convenient. This is the point at which the hunting accident explanation, however plausible on its surface, begins to strain under the weight of its own coincidences. Consider what we are asked to accept: that the King of England was killed by a stray arrow in a forest his own family had claimed and hunted in for over 3 decades, among men who knew that terrain and its dangers intimately. That the man responsible fled the country immediately without attempting to explain himself, defend himself, or even confirm to anyone what had happened. That the nobles present scattered not toward the fallen king but toward the treasury, and that the king's own brother happened to be perfectly positioned, perfectly informed, and perfectly prepared to seize the throne within 72 hours of his sibling's death, while the true heir was conveniently absent from the country entirely. Any one of these details, taken alone, might be dismissed as circumstance. Together they have fueled 9 centuries of suspicion that William Rufus's death in the New Forest was not an accident at all, that it was, in fact, an assassination, orchestrated with Henry's knowledge, if not his direct involvement, and that Walter Tyrrell either fired the fatal shot as an instrument of a wider conspiracy, or was simply the convenient scapegoat for a killing carried out by someone else entirely, someone whose identity the chroniclers, writing under Henry's own rule, dependent on Henry's own favor, had every reason never to name. What then does the mainstream historical view actually hold? Most historians today lean toward the accident explanation, and there are reasonable grounds for that conclusion. Hunting deaths were not uncommon in medieval Europe. The forests were genuinely dangerous. Arrows genuinely did glance off trees and branches in unpredictable directions, and William Rufus's own brother Richard had died in a hunting accident in that very same forest years earlier, along with a nephew killed there as well, lending an eerie, almost cursed reputation to the New Forest that predates William's death and suggests, at minimum, that fatal hunting mishaps in that particular stretch of woodland were disturbingly frequent rather than singularly suspicious. Walter Tyrrell's flight in this reading was not the panic of a guilty assassin, but the entirely rational fear of a man who had, however accidentally, just killed a king, and understood that regardless of intent, he would likely be blamed, possibly executed, certainly ruined, and that his only hope of survival lay in reaching the safety of his own lands across the Channel before anyone decided his death was more useful to them than his trial. And Henry's rapid coronation, defenders of the accident theory argue, reflects not advanced planning for murder, but simply the hard political realities of the age. A throne could not be left vacant. Rival claimants and rebellious nobles could exploit any delay, and a Norman prince with royal blood already present in England had both the right and the practical necessity to secure the crown immediately, particularly with his brother Robert still making his way back from crusade and in no position to contest the succession quickly enough to matter. But the speculative theories, the ones that have never quite been extinguished however carefully historians have tried to explain away the coincidences, point in a very different direction. The most persistent points squarely at Henry himself. Under this theory, Henry either arranged for Tyrrell or another hunter to kill his brother outright, or seized on an actual accident with such swiftness and precision that his prior knowledge of, or complicity in, the plan becomes difficult to dismiss. Henry had motive in abundance. As the youngest son, he stood to inherit little under Norman custom, had already been passed over once for both the English throne and significant continental territory, and understood better than anyone that his brother Robert's absence on crusade created a narrow closing window of opportunity that would vanish the moment Robert returned to Europe. Henry also had the resources: loyal supporters already positioned near Winchester, familiarity with the forest, and a political shrewdness that would define his entire 25-year reign, one built, from its very first days, on ruthless, and remarkably well-timed decision-making. Other theories reach even further into the political undercurrents of the age. Some point to the church, noting William Rufus's notoriously hostile relationship with ecclesiastical authorities. He had left the Archbishopric of Canterbury deliberately vacant for years, pocketing its revenues, and had clashed repeatedly and bitterly with figures like Anselm, suggesting that a churchman's hand, or at least a churchman's blessing, might lie somewhere behind the events in the forest that day. Others have wondered about the Clare family, Walter Tyrrell's powerful in-laws, whose own ambitions at court might have found a conveniently disposable king more useful dead than alive, with Tyrrell serving less as a lone hunter with bad aim than as an instrument of a wider family calculation. None of these theories carry documentary proof. All of them exploit the same maddening gap in the record. No trial was ever held, no formal inquiry into the king's death appears in the surviving chronicles, and Walter Tyrrell, the one man who might have settled the matter definitively, spent the rest of his life on the continent, protected by distance and by a new king who, whether from magnanimity or self-interest, never once demanded his return to face justice. That absence of pursuit is, to many who study the case, nearly as suspicious as anything else in the record. A king had died, struck down by an identified named living nobleman who fled the realm rather than explain himself. And yet the new king, Henry, made no recorded effort across the following decades to extradite Tyrrell, try him, or extract from him any formal account of what happened in that clearing. Was this simply Norman-era pragmatism? A recognition that pursuing a nobleman abroad over what was, after all, most likely a tragic accident, served no one's political interests? Or was it something closer to gratitude, quietly extended toward a man who had done, deliberately or not, exactly what Henry needed done, at precisely the moment Henry needed it? We are left, as with so many of these medieval deaths, staring into a gap the historical record simply cannot close. The physical evidence is long gone. No arrow survives. No autopsy was ever possible. No forensic science can be applied 9 centuries later to remains interred in Winchester Cathedral and subsequently lost or displaced during later renovations. What we have instead is a pattern. A suspiciously convenient death. A suspiciously well-prepared beneficiary. A suspiciously rapid disappearance of the one witness who might have explained everything, and a suspicious absence of any formal reckoning in the years that followed. The Rufus stone still stands today in the New Forest, marking, approximately, and with more symbolic intent than precise accuracy, the spot where William II is said to have fallen. Visitors walk past it in a woodland that looks, in its dappled afternoon light, very much as it must have looked on that August day in 1100. Peaceful, ordinary, entirely unremarkable, betraying nothing of what may or may not have happened there. Was William Rufus simply the victim of an ordinary hunting mishap? One death among many in a forest already notorious for claiming the lives of the men who hunted it? Or did his own brother, watching a crusading rival's absence create a window that would never open so conveniently again, arrange for that arrow to find its mark, and then move fast enough and rule long enough to ensure that no chronicler, no court, and no investigation would ever be permitted to look too closely at what truly happened beneath those Hampshire oaks? That same problem. A stone marker standing in for a truth the ground itself refuses to give up, reappears a few centuries later and a few hundred miles west, in a country that has spent over 600 years searching for something it has never quite been able to find. A grave. Not a battlefield. Not a tower. Not a forest clearing marked by an iron post. Just an absence. A hole in the historical record so complete that an entire nation has spent centuries wondering not how a man died, but where, when, and under what circumstances he simply stopped appearing in it at all. We are in Wales, in the early autumn of 1415, somewhere in the rugged, mist-heavy hill country of the Welsh Marches. Though somewhere is, in this case, doing an enormous amount of work because no one, then or now, can say with certainty exactly where. Somewhere in these hills, or perhaps somewhere else entirely, the man who had spent over a decade leading the last great Welsh rebellion against English rule simply vanished from history and was never conclusively seen, heard from, or accounted for again. His name was Owain Glyndŵr, in the anglicized spelling that has come down to us, Owen Glendower, and for a brief, extraordinary period at the turn of the 15th century, he had done something no Welsh leader had managed in over 100 years. He had raised a genuine, sustained nationwide rebellion against the English crown, declared himself Prince of Wales, summoned an independent Welsh parliament, negotiated as an equal with the kings of France and Scotland, and controlled, at the height of his power, nearly the entirety of Wales. To understand why his eventual disappearance became one of the most enduring mysteries in British history, we need to understand just how remarkable his rise had been, and just how completely and strangely his fall unfolded in the years that followed. Glyndŵr was not by birth an obvious candidate for rebellion. He came from Welsh nobility with genuine claims to ancient royal lineage, descended from the princes of Powys and Deheubarth. But he had spent much of his early life within the English establishment itself, trained in London at the Inns of Court, serving as a soldier under the English crown, living the life of a moderately prosperous, well-connected Welsh gentleman on good terms with his English neighbors. It was, by most accounts, a personal dispute, a land conflict with a powerful English marcher lord, Reginald de Grey, who Glyndŵr believed had deliberately sabotaged him, withholding a royal summons to military service and causing Glyndŵr to be branded a traitor for failing to appear. That provided the spark. In September 1400, Glyndŵr was proclaimed Prince of Wales by his followers, and what began as a personal grievance exploded with startling speed into a national uprising. For the better part of a decade, Glyndŵr's rebellion achieved what must have seemed, to contemporaries, almost impossible. Welsh forces captured English-held castles across the country. Glyndŵr allied with rebellious English nobles, including the powerful Percy family, in a coordinated challenge to the rule of King Henry IV. He secured formal military support from France, with French troops landing on Welsh soil to fight alongside him. He held parliaments at Machynlleth and Harlech, articulated a vision of an independent Wales with its own church, its own universities, its own governance entirely separate from English control. For a few remarkable years, an independent Welsh state was not merely imagined, but functioning. And then, gradually, inexorably, it began to unravel. English military pressure under the future Henry III, then still Prince of Wales himself, tasked with crushing the rebellion he had grown up fighting, slowly ground down Glyndŵr's territorial gains. Harlech Castle, his last major stronghold, fell in 1409, and Glyndŵr's own family, including his wife and several children, were captured and taken to the Tower of London, where his wife would die in captivity. French support withdrew. Former allies were killed, captured, or reconciled with the English crown. By 1412, Glyndŵr himself had vanished from any documented military engagement, and his once formidable rebellion had dissolved into scattered, increasingly hopeless guerrilla resistance in the Welsh hills. But here is where the case becomes genuinely, historically strange, not because Glyndŵr was captured or killed or forced into a documented surrender, but because none of those things happened. He simply stopped appearing in the record. Unlike virtually every other major medieval rebel leader in British history, Owain Glyndŵr was never captured. He was never executed. He never formally surrendered. He never appears in any contemporary account describing his death, his burial, or his final years. In 1415, the same year notably that Henry V would win his legendary victory at Agincourt, Glyndŵr's son Meredith was offered, and eventually accepted, a royal pardon on behalf of the family. But Owain himself was never offered such a pardon by name, and no surviving document records what became of him after that point. He simply disappears from the historical record entirely, sometime around 1415, at an age of roughly 60. An old man by medieval standards, for a guerrilla leader still evading the full military might of the English crown. This absence is, in itself, extraordinary. Medieval governments were meticulous record keepers when it came to rebels, particularly rebels of Glyndŵr's stature, a man who had once controlled most of Wales, allied with France, and humiliated an English king. His capture or death would have been trumpeted, documented, celebrated in exactly the kind of official record that survives in abundance for far less significant figures of the period. And yet nothing. No captured rebel prince paraded through London, no execution recorded at the Tower, no confirmed grave, no death date agreed upon by contemporary chroniclers, no body ever produced, examined, or buried with any ceremony anyone thought worth recording. The most widely accepted mainstream historical explanation is almost anticlimactic in its plausibility. That Glyndŵr by 1412 or so recognized that his rebellion was irrecoverably lost, and rather than continue a doomed guerrilla struggle or risk capture and a traitor's execution, he simply went into hiding, sheltered by loyal Welsh families in the remote hill country, moving quietly between safe houses, living out his final years not as a fugitive prince, but as an anonymous old man, protected by a Welsh population that, even in defeat, refused to betray him to English authorities. Under this reading, Glyndŵr likely died of natural causes sometime around 1415, perhaps at the home of one of his daughters, and was buried quietly without ceremony in an unmarked grave whose location his protectors deliberately never recorded, precisely because recording it would have meant risking exhumation, desecration, or simply confirming to the English crown that the rebellion's leader was at last safely dead. Several specific locations have been proposed for that final resting place, based on scattered local tradition and fragmentary later testimony. The most frequently cited is Monington Court in Herefordshire, the home of Glyndŵr's daughter Alice and her husband, where a persistent local tradition holds that the old rebel spent his final years and was buried, possibly beneath an unmarked mound in a nearby orchard, its precise location lost within a generation or two of his death. Other traditions point toward different sites entirely: a grave somewhere near Kentchurch, another Herefordshire estate connected to the family, scattered claims from various parts of Wales itself, each community offering its own local legend of where the last true Prince of Wales came to rest. None of these can be confirmed. No archaeological excavation has ever definitively located Glyndŵr's remains. No contemporary document names a burial site with any specificity. What we have instead is a patchwork of oral tradition, recorded generations after the fact, shaped as much by communities wanting to claim a connection to a national hero as by any verifiable historical fact. And it is in this gap, this genuine, historically unusual absence of confirmed information, that the more speculative theories have flourished. Some, drawing on the deep well of Welsh folklore that had already begun forming around Glyndŵr even within his own lifetime, suggested something closer to legend than history. That Glyndŵr had not died in hiding at all, but had possessed genuine mystical or prophetic abilities, a reputation he'd cultivated even during the rebellion, when contemporary English chroniclers, including Shakespeare himself in Henry IV, portrayed him as a figure who claimed command over supernatural forces, and that his disappearance was less a death in hiding than something closer to a deliberate vanishing, a final act by a man some of his followers had come to see as more than merely human. This theory, it should be said, sits closer to folklore than to serious historical argument, but its persistence says something about how thoroughly Glyndŵr's genuine documented disappearance blurred into legend precisely because the historical record offered so little to correct it. Others have proposed more grounded, though still unproven, alternatives. That Glyndŵr may have died earlier than generally assumed, perhaps as early as 1413 or 1414, his final years quietly folded into the historical record's silence, simply because there was, by that point, no one left with reason to document them. Or conversely, that he may have lived slightly longer than the traditional 1415 date suggests, his family's eventual acceptance of pardon in that year reflecting not necessarily his death, but perhaps his final, quiet acknowledgement that the cause was over, whether or not he himself was still alive to acknowledge it personally. What makes Glyndŵr's disappearance different from the deaths we've traced elsewhere in this exploration is precisely this. It may not be a murder mystery at all. There is no poison, no arrow, no bolted door, no obvious villain whose motives we can weigh and debate. What we have instead is something rarer and, in its own way, more haunting. A powerful man who seems to have simply chosen to disappear, protected so completely by the loyalty of an entire population that even 6 centuries of English administrative thoroughness and 6 centuries more of historical curiosity have never managed to locate where, or precisely when, his story actually ended. Perhaps that, in the end, is its own kind of answer. A rebellion that could not be crushed by force was allowed, instead, to fade quietly into secrecy, protected by the very people it had tried to liberate. Its leader's final resting place kept hidden, not because anyone had something to conceal, but because an entire nation, having lost the war, chose to win this smaller, quieter victory, denying its enemies even the satisfaction of a grave to point to. Walk today through the Herefordshire orchards near Monington, or the quiet hill villages of the Welsh interior, and you will find no shortage of local voices ready to tell you, with real conviction, exactly where Owain Glyndŵr rests. You will also find that no two of them entirely agree. 600 years on, the last Prince of Wales remains, in the most literal sense, unburied by history. His death never confirmed, his grave never found, his final years lost somewhere in the silence his own people built around him. Was that silence an act of profound loyalty? An entire population conspiring, generation after generation, to protect a hero even after his own death? Or does it point to something else? A man whose end came so quietly, so far from the historical spotlight that had once made him a prince and a rebel and a legend, that there was, in truth, never very much to record at all. Loyalty that outlasts the crime, an entire community, or in this case an entire family, closing ranks around a truth too dangerous to speak aloud, is not unique to the hill country of Wales. It reappears, less than a century later, in the heart of Rome itself, in a family whose name would become, fairly or not, a byword for exactly this kind of practiced purposeful silence. The river Tiber moves slowly through Rome in the early hours before dawn, its dark water carrying centuries of the city's secrets toward the sea. On the morning of June 15, 1497, a timber merchant named Giorgio Schiavi, who made his living guarding stacked lumber along the riverbank near the Ripetta docks, was asked by papal officials whether he had seen or heard anything unusual during the night. He had. He told them that sometime after midnight, he had watched a group of men appear on the riverbank, look carefully around to ensure no one observed them, and then throw the body of a man into the river, weighing it down, or so it seemed, deliberately. When asked why he hadn't reported it at the time, Schiavi is said to have given an answer that has echoed through 5 centuries of Roman history ever since. That he had, in his years guarding that stretch of riverbank at night, seen perhaps 100 bodies thrown into the Tiber, and had never once thought it worth mentioning to anyone. This time, the body pulled from the river, recovered later that same day, fully clothed, gloves and purse still containing 30 ducats untouched, 9 wounds visible on the corpse, his throat slit, belonged to no ordinary Roman. It was Giovanni Borgia, Duke of Gandia, 20 years old, favorite son of Pope Alexander VI, and, until the moment his body surfaced from the Tiber, one of the most powerful and privileged young men in all of Italy. To understand why his murder became one of the defining scandals of the Italian Renaissance, a case still debated, still argued over, still fundamentally unresolved more than 500 years later, we need to understand the family he belonged to, and just how much was quietly, carefully, at stake within it. The Borgias were, by 1497, arguably the single most powerful family in Italy. Rodrigo Borgia had become Pope Alexander VI in 1492, and had spent the years since methodically advancing his children's fortunes, with a single-mindedness that scandalized even a Rome well accustomed to nepotism among its pontiffs. Giovanni, the Duke of Gandia, was his father's evident favorite, showered with Spanish titles, military commands, and papal favor, positioned as the family's secular standard-bearer, the son through whom Alexander intended to build a lasting Borgia dynasty of temporal power stretching across Italy and Spain alike. But Giovanni was not the Pope's only ambitious son. His elder brother, chronologically younger by some accounts, the exact birth order among the Borgia children remaining itself a matter of some historical dispute, was Cesare Borgia, a young man of formidable intelligence, ruthless political instinct, and consuming ambition, who had been pushed by his father into a career in the church, despite showing little genuine religious vocation and, by most accounts, considerable resentment at watching his brother receive the military titles, the papal favor, and the secular glory that Cesare himself seems to have wanted for his own. On the night of Giovanni's death, the two brothers had dined together, along with their mother, Vannozza dei Catanei, and their cousin Cardinal Juan Borgia, at a family gathering. After the meal, Giovanni and Cesare rode out together into the Roman night, accompanied by a small retinue, before separating, Giovanni reportedly telling his brother he had other pleasures to attend to, a phrase Renaissance chroniclers have puzzled over ever since, generally understood to suggest a romantic assignation, though with whom, precisely, has never been established with certainty. He dismissed most of his attendants, keeping only a single groom and a mysterious masked man who had, according to witness accounts, been visiting Giovanni regularly at the Vatican in the weeks before his death. A figure never identified, whose presence has fueled speculation for centuries. Giovanni was never seen alive again. His groom, found the next day severely wounded but alive, could offer no coherent account of what had happened. The masked man was never located at all. When word reached Pope Alexander VI that his favorite son's body had been recovered from the Tiber, riddled with wounds and thrown into the river like a common criminal, the Pope's grief was, by every contemporary account, immediate, total, and almost frightening in its intensity. He shut himself away, reportedly refused food for days, and was heard through closed doors, weeping and crying out that he would give up 7 papacies to have his son restored to life. He ordered an investigation, swift, urgent, backed by the full authority of the papal court, into who had murdered Giovanni Borgia. And then, within days, that investigation simply stopped. No formal conclusion was ever announced. No suspect was ever named, tried, or punished by papal authority. The inquiry that Alexander himself had demanded with such evident anguish in the immediate aftermath of his son's death went quiet almost as suddenly as it had begun, a silence that contemporary observers found even at the time deeply strange, and which has fueled speculation ever since about what the Pope may have learned and why he chose, or was persuaded, not to pursue it further. The mainstream historical explanations for who killed Giovanni Borgia fall into several categories, each with genuine contemporary support, none conclusively provable. The most immediately obvious, given the political landscape of Renaissance Rome, points toward the Orsini family, longtime rivals of the Borgias, whose territories and influence had suffered directly from Pope Alexander's campaigns to consolidate papal authority across the Papal States, campaigns in which Giovanni himself had played an active military role shortly before his death, commanding papal forces against Orsini strongholds with middling success. The Orsini had motive, opportunity, and a documented history of violent rivalry with the Borgias. And Giovanni, as the Pope's son and a military commander who had recently campaigned against their interests, was an obvious target for a family with both the resources and the grievance to arrange such a killing. Another mainstream theory points to Giovanni Sforza, the estranged husband of Giovanni's sister, Lucrezia Borgia, a marriage that had recently ended amid considerable scandal, in an annulment that Sforza experienced as a profound personal and political humiliation, one he believed had been engineered by the Borgias for their own dynastic convenience, discarding him once his usefulness as a political alliance had expired. A husband humiliated by a family capable of unmaking his marriage on their own terms, some historians have argued, had ample reason to want a measure of revenge against that family's favored son. Still others have pointed toward Guidobaldo da Montefeltro, Duke of Urbino, whose territories had likewise come under pressure from Borgia expansionism, or toward any number of the smaller Italian noble families whose fortunes had suffered as Pope Alexander methodically carved out territory and influence for his children across central Italy, a strategy that, by 1497, had generated no shortage of enemies with genuine reason to want a Borgia son dead, and no particular reason to distinguish carefully between which Borgia son they targeted, so long as the message landed. And then there is the theory that has proven, over 5 centuries, the most persistently unsettling of all. Because unlike the others, it does not point outward, toward rivals and rival families, but inward, toward the family's own dinner table. Cesare Borgia. The case against Cesare rests on a familiar architecture of motive and opportunity that will, by now, sound familiar from every chapter of this exploration. A brother chafing under the shadow of a more favored sibling, resentful of the military glory and secular titles denied to him by his father's insistence that he pursue a church career instead, the last person confirmed to have seen Giovanni alive before he rode off into the Roman night. Cesare would go on, in the years following his brother's death, to abandon the church entirely, secure the very military titles and secular power that had once belonged to Giovanni, and build, through a campaign of conquest and calculated ruthlessness across central Italy, precisely the kind of dynastic legacy that Giovanni, as the favored son, had once seemed destined to inherit. Later Renaissance chroniclers, including some writing decades after the fact, would openly name Cesare as his brother's murderer, describing a young man whose ambition had curdled into something willing to remove even family from its path. Contemporary Venetian ambassadors, whose diplomatic dispatches remain among the most valuable surviving sources on the period, reported rumors circulating in Rome within days of the murder that pointed directly at Cesare. Rumors serious enough and persistent enough that they may explain the otherwise puzzling collapse of Alexander's own investigation. Had the Pope's inquiries led him, within days, to a conclusion so devastating that his own most promising surviving son had murdered his favorite, that continuing the investigation publicly became unthinkable? Was the sudden silence that followed Alexander's initial, very public grief not indifference, but something closer to a father's unbearable choice? Justice for one son, or the survival and legacy of the family entire? No definitive evidence has ever surfaced to confirm Cesare's guilt. No contemporary document records a confession, an accusation formally leveled and proven, or physical evidence connecting him directly to the killing. What exists instead is pattern and circumstance, motive substantial enough to be plausible, opportunity beyond dispute, a subsequent career built with striking speed atop the exact position his brother's death had vacated, and a papal investigation that began with extraordinary urgency and ended, within days, in a silence that has never been adequately explained by any surviving record. It is worth pausing here on what that silence may actually represent, because it echoes something we have already seen in a different country, protecting a different kind of secret. In Wales, a nation's quiet loyalty denied an occupying power the satisfaction of a grave. In Rome, a father's silence, whether born of grief too total to continue or knowledge too dangerous to pursue, denied history the satisfaction of a verdict. Both silences have proven, across the centuries, remarkably effective. Neither has ever fully broken. What we are left with, 500 years later, is a river that gave up a body, but kept its witnesses to itself. A timber merchant who had seen too many bodies to think one more worth mentioning. A masked visitor whose identity was never recovered. A groom too wounded or too frightened to offer a coherent account. And a pope whose grief was, by every measure, genuine and total, yet who chose, in the end, not to follow that grief to wherever it might have led. Was Giovanni Borgia killed by the accumulated enemies his family's relentless ambition had made across Italy? The Orsini, the Sforza, the Montefeltro, any one of a dozen noble houses with reason enough to want a Borgia son dead? Or did the killer never leave the family at all? Did he sit, that final evening, at the same table, share the same meal, and ride out into the same Roman night beside the brother he would never see alive again. The Tiber has never answered. Alexander VI never spoke of it publicly again in any way historians have been able to recover, and Cesare Borgia, whatever he knew or didn't, carried it with him through a career remembered ever since for exactly the kind of calculated ruthlessness his brother's death would have required, leaving behind a question that Rome, for all its meticulous record-keeping, its dispatches and diaries and diplomatic correspondence, has never once definitively resolved. When a family builds its power on secrets, how many of those secrets, in the end, are kept even from itself? From the banks of the Tiber, we travel north and west again. Back across the Alps, across the Channel, into the same misty hills and river valleys of Wales, where, in an earlier chapter, an entire nation kept silent about the final resting place of its last great rebel prince. But this mystery predates Owain Glyndŵr by more than a century, and it does not concern a man who chose to vanish. It concerns two boys who did not choose anything at all, and a castle wall that has never fully given up what happened behind it. The castle is Criccheth, perched on a rocky headland overlooking Tremadoc Bay on the coast of Gwynedd, in the far northwest of Wales. A fortress with commanding views over the sea, its walls built and rebuilt across generations of Welsh, and later, English rule. And it is within these walls, sometime in the final years of the 13th century, that two young boys, cousins, both direct descendants of the royal house of Gwynedd, the last independent princely dynasty of Wales, were held as prisoners. Their names were Owain ap Dafydd and Llywelyn ap Owain. And at some point, quietly, without any surviving contemporary record explaining precisely when or how, both of them simply stopped appearing in the historical documentation of their own captivity. A captivity that, by the reckoning of the surviving evidence, lasted decades, and which ended in a silence historians have never been able to fully penetrate. To understand why two Welsh boys imprisoned in a castle on the edge of the sea became such an enduring historical puzzle, we need to go back to the collapse of Welsh independence itself. A collapse that unfolded with brutal finality in the closing decades of the 13th century, and which left behind a scattered handful of royal children whose very existence posed a lasting, uncomfortable question for the English crown that had conquered their homeland. Gwynedd, in the years before its fall, had been the most powerful of the Welsh kingdoms, its rulers having spent generations building something close to genuine national leadership over Wales as a whole. Llywelyn ap Gruffudd, Llywelyn the Last, as he would come to be known, had achieved, briefly, formal recognition as Prince of Wales under English law before a renewed war with Edward I of England ended in his death in 1282, and the subsequent systematic conquest and annexation of Gwynedd into the English crown's possessions. Llywelyn's own brother, Dafydd ap Gruffudd, continued a doomed resistance for several more months before being captured and executed with a brutality, hanged, drawn, and quartered, the first recorded use of that particular punishment on an English nobleman of his rank, designed explicitly to signal that Welsh royal resistance would be answered with total, exemplary destruction. But conquest for Edward I meant more than defeating armies and executing leaders. It meant permanently extinguishing any future claim to independent Welsh rule, and that meant dealing, carefully and quietly, with the children left behind. Dafydd ap Gruffudd had sons. Llywelyn ap Gruffudd had a daughter, Gwenllian, who was seized as an infant and sent to a convent in Lincolnshire, spending her entire life in religious confinement, dying decades later having apparently never learned Welsh, the language of the people she had been born to rule. A quiet, almost bureaucratic erasure of an entire bloodline that stands as its own kind of tragedy, though a comparatively well-documented one. Dafydd's sons, however, the two boys who concern us here, Owain and Llywelyn, sons of Dafydd's own son Owain, were treated differently, and it is in that difference that the mystery takes shape. Rather than being placed in a convent or otherwise formally accounted for in the manner of Gwenllian, the boys were imprisoned, held first, according to surviving records, at Bristol Castle, then later transferred to Criccieth, back on Welsh soil itself, in what appears to have been a calculated decision to keep them close enough to monitor, far enough from any center of potential Welsh resistance to render them politically inert. Royal financial records. The kind of administrative documentation medieval England kept with remarkable, almost obsessive thoroughness for matters of expenditure. Record payments for their maintenance, their clothing, their food, across a span of decades. These records give us our clearest window into their captivity. Not a dramatic account of cruelty or negotiation, but the dry, bureaucratic evidence of two boys who grew into young men, then into middle-aged men, entirely within the confines of a fortress they had likely never chosen and could never leave. And then, in the early 14th century, the records simply stop. This is the heart of the mystery, and it is worth sitting with precisely how strange this silence is. Medieval English administration, as we've already seen in other cases across this exploration, tended toward meticulous record-keeping, particularly where royal expenditure and matters of state security were concerned. Prisoners of this political significance, held for decades at crown expense, would ordinarily generate a documentary trail extending right up to the moment of their release, death, or transfer. Yet for Owain ap Dafydd and Llywelyn ap Owain, that trail simply thins, then vanishes, sometime in the second decade of the 14th century, without any surviving record of an execution, a formal release, a transfer to a different location, or even a straightforward notation of natural death. The kind of administrative full stop we would expect to find, and do find, in comparable cases elsewhere in the same archives. The most widely accepted mainstream historical explanation holds that both men, or at least Owain, the more thoroughly documented of the two, simply died in captivity of natural causes, likely sometime in the 1310s, after a lifetime of imprisonment stretching back to childhood, and that the absence of a more dramatic documentary record reflects nothing more sinister than the declining political relevance of two aging prisoners whose royal bloodline, by that point, posed little practical threat to a Wales that had now been under English administration for over 3 decades. Under this reading, the silence is not evidence of concealment, but simply evidence of diminishing bureaucratic interest. The Crown, having successfully neutralized any threat these men might once have represented, simply stopped bothering to document their continued, uneventful captivity in any detail worth preserving. This explanation is plausible, consistent with how medieval administrative records often do thin out around matters of declining political urgency, and accepted by most historians as the likeliest account of what happened to at least one of the two cousins. But it does not fully satisfy every question the case raises. And it is in the gaps this explanation leaves open that more speculative theories have found room to grow. Because Owain ap Dafydd and Llywelyn ap Owain were not, in fact, the last of their line. And this is where the story takes on a genuinely unsettling dimension that distinguishes it from a simple case of two forgotten prisoners fading quietly from the record. Some historians and Welsh genealogists have pointed to later, scattered references, thin, difficult to fully verify, but persistent across various Welsh sources, suggesting descendants or relatives of the Gwynedd royal line continuing to surface, in various capacities, across Wales for generations after Owain and Llywelyn's imprisonment, occasionally becoming entangled, whether by coincidence or by design, in subsequent moments of Welsh unrest, including, intriguingly, in the era of Owain Glyndŵr's rebellion itself nearly a century later. If genuine sustained bloodline continuity from the House of Gwynedd persisted into the 15th century, it raises a pointed question about the two cousins imprisoned at Criccieth. Were they truly the last legitimate male claimants the English crown needed to neutralize, or simply the two whose capture and confinement happened to be the most convenient, the most visible, the easiest to document and control, while other descendants, less visible to the crown's attention, survived and continued the bloodline elsewhere, unrecorded and unmonitored? There is also the more direct and unsettling question that the missing final records leave entirely open. Did these two men die naturally in captivity at all, Or does the sudden absence of documentation reflect something the Crown had specific reason not to record? Executions of high-status political prisoners, even quiet ones conducted without public ceremony, tended to leave some trace in the surviving record. A payment for a burial, a brief chronicler's mention, something. The complete absence of any such trace for Owain and Llywelyn has led some to wonder whether their deaths, whenever and however they occurred, were deliberately left undocumented, not through bureaucratic indifference, but through calculated discretion, ensuring that two men whose royal Welsh blood might, even in death, have provided a rallying symbol for future resistance, simply cease to exist in the official record as quietly and untraceably as possible. We are left once again with a documentary silence that could plausibly indicate nothing more than administrative neglect, or could conceal something considerably more deliberate. And unlike several of the other cases we've examined in this exploration, there is no dramatic single event to investigate here. No arrow, no cord, no body pulled from a river. There is only the slow, decades-long fade of two lives from the official record of the kingdom that had conquered their family, imprisoned them as children, and then, at some point, no surviving document precisely marks, simply stopped writing about them at all. Crisheth Castle still stands today above Tremadoc Bay, its walls weathered by centuries of Atlantic wind, its rooms long since emptied of whatever furnishings once marked the daily reality of two boys who grew old within them, never having known, as far as any surviving record tells us, a single day of freedom. Visitors walk its battlements today largely unaware that anyone was ever held there at all, let alone two men whose entire lives, from childhood capture to whatever quiet end eventually came for them, passed within sight of a sea they may never have been permitted to sail. Did Owain ap Dafydd and Llywelyn ap Owain simply grow old and die, forgotten prisoners whose passing genuinely didn't merit further royal attention once their bloodline's threat had faded with time? Or does their disappearance from the record mark something the English crown, even decades after conquering Wales, still considered too politically sensitive to commit to parchment? The quiet, deliberate erasure of the last legitimate male claimants to a throne that England had worked so hard and so violently to extinguish. And if their bloodline did, in fact, continue beyond those castle walls, surviving quietly in some corner of Wales the crown's attention never quite reached, what would it mean that the House of Gwynedd, the dynasty that had once nearly unified an independent Wales, may not have ended in that fortress at all, but simply slipped, unnoticed, back into the hills its ancestors had once ruled? Silence, first. Then the low groan of a bolt sliding home, iron against iron, somewhere above. A corridor in the Castel Nuovo, Naples, on the night of the 18th of September, 1345. Torchlight moves along a stone passage barely wide enough for two men to pass shoulder to shoulder. The air smells of tallow smoke and the sea, which presses close against the castle's seaward walls. Somewhere behind a door at the end of this passage, a young man is asleep, or trying to be. He is 19 years old. He is a prince of Hungary, husband to the reigning Queen of Naples, and within the hour, he will be dead. This is the corridor historians now call, without much need for embellishment, the site of one of the most notorious court murders of the 14th century, the killing of Andrew, Duke of Calabria. To understand what happened in that passage, we have to understand what Naples was in 1345, a kingdom stitched together from French ambition, Italian wealth, and a papal blessing that never quite settled anyone's nerves. The House of Anjou had ruled here for over a century, planted on the throne by a pope who wanted a loyal sword arm in southern Italy. By the time our story begins, the Angevin dynasty had grown into something closer to a single sprawling, quarrelsome family than a stable government. Cousins marrying cousins, thrones promised and repromised, and a court in Naples that functioned as much through whispered alliances as through written law. At the center of this arrangement sat two children, married almost from the cradle for reasons of dynastic convenience. Joanna, granddaughter of King Robert the Wise, had been raised as heir to the throne of Naples in her own right, a queen regnant, not a consort. Andrew, her husband, was the son of the King of Hungary, sent south as a boy to be raised alongside his future wife in the Neapolitan court. The marriage had been arranged to heal a rift within the Angevin family, to bind the Hungarian and Neapolitan branches back together after decades of rivalry over who truly had the better claim to the throne. On paper, it should have worked. In practice, it produced something closer to a slow-burning crisis. Andrew was raised believing, not unreasonably given his birth, that he should reign as king in his own right, not merely as the husband of a queen. His mother, Elizabeth of Poland, pressed the case relentlessly with Pope Clement VI, requesting a papal coronation that would elevate Andrew from consort to co-ruler. The Neapolitan nobility, and by most accounts Joanna herself, resisted the idea. The court split quietly but unmistakably into factions, those who supported Andrew's ambitions and those who saw him, a foreigner, a Hungarian, however royal his blood, as an intruder into a Neapolitan inheritance that belonged to Joanna alone. By September of 1345, that coronation question still hung unresolved. And into that unresolved tension, on a hunting trip to the town of Aversa, a group of conspirators inserted themselves into history. The mainstream account, drawn from contemporary chronicles and the records of the trials that followed, runs roughly like this. The royal party had traveled to the monastery of San Pietro a Maiella in Aversa, ostensibly for a few days of hunting and rest away from the capital. On the night of the 18th, Andrew was roused from bed. Some accounts say by a servant claiming urgent business, others by a message purporting to come from Joanna herself. He stepped into the corridor outside the bedchamber, and there, according to the testimony later extracted under torture from several of the accused, he was seized by a group of court intimates, strangled with a cord, and thrown from a window into the monastery garden below. Joanna, the chronicles report, remained in the bedchamber throughout, asleep, or pretending to be, depending on which account you trust. She would later claim to have heard nothing until the alarm was raised. That much is close to consensus. What comes next is where the mystery begins in earnest. Who gave the order? The list of suspects reads like a roll call of the Neapolitan court itself. Robert of Cabanis, the Queen's chamberlain and rumored lover, was named by several of those tortured. Philippa the Catanian, an old nursemaid of Joanna's who had risen to extraordinary influence in the household, was implicated along with her son and daughter-in-law. Even Joanna's own cousins, Robert and Louis of Taranto, rival claimants with their own designs on the throne, moved through the accusations, named and unnamed in turn, their motives as tangled as their bloodlines. And Joanna herself. The question of Joanna's guilt has never fully closed, and it likely never will. Contemporary observers, particularly those hostile to her, including the Hungarian royal house, who had every reason to want her condemned, insisted she had known of the plot, perhaps even ordered it, tired of a husband who threatened her sovereignty and her independence. Others, including several later historians more sympathetic to her position, argue that a 19-year-old queen sleeping 20 feet from her husband's murder is not by itself evidence of complicity, that the true architects were courtiers protecting their own influence, men and women who stood to lose everything if Andrew were crowned king in fact, as well as name. What makes the case genuinely difficult, rather than simply unresolved through lack of evidence, is the nature of the evidence that does exist. The confessions we have, and there were confessions, extracted from several of the accused, came under torture, administered first by Neapolitan authorities eager to demonstrate they were pursuing justice, and later by a papal legate sent to reinvestigate when the first round of trials satisfied almost no one. Confession under torture is a peculiar kind of historical evidence. It tells us what people were made to say, not necessarily what happened. Names surfaced, were repeated, were perhaps supplied by the questioners themselves. Some of the accused implicated Joanna. Others, under equally severe questioning, did not. The two rounds of trials, the Neapolitan inquiry and the later, more rigorous investigation ordered by Pope Clement VI, did not fully agree with each other, and neither produced a confession from Joanna nor definitive proof to convict her. She was never formally charged. She continued to reign, with interruptions, with exile, with a second marriage to her cousin Louis of Taranto that many read as confirmation of guilt, and others read as simple political necessity for a young queen who needed a strong consort to hold her throne against rival claims. She would go on to rule Naples in various capacities for nearly 4 decades after Andrew's death, becoming one of the most consequential and most contested female rulers of medieval Europe. Dante had already placed corrupt Neapolitan rulers in his inferno before Joanna's reign even began. Her critics, and there were many, would spend the rest of her life and long after finding new reasons to add her to that same company. This is where the mainstream historical record largely settles. A murder with too many plausible suspects, a queen whose innocence or guilt cannot be proven either way from the surviving evidence, and a set of confessions too compromised by torture to serve as reliable testimony. Most serious historians today treat the crime as what it almost certainly was, a palace conspiracy involving multiple court factions threatened by Andrew's coronation ambitions, with Joanna's personal role remaining, and likely remaining forever, genuinely uncertain. But history, especially medieval history, rarely stays contained within the boundaries of genuinely uncertain. Where the documentary record thins out, other kinds of stories tend to grow. One thread worth following, even if only to see where it leads, involves the object said to have been used in the murder itself. The cord, or in some versions a length of rope or a scarf, wrapped around Andrew's throat in that corridor. Chroniclers writing decades after the event added details that don't appear in the earlier, more contemporary accounts. That the murder weapon was later recovered and kept, quietly, as a kind of relic or warning by one of the families implicated in the plot. That its presence in a household was considered proof, whispered but never formally acted upon, of that family's guilt. No such object survives today, if it ever existed in the form the later chroniclers describe. But the persistence of the detail, showing up again and again in second-hand retellings, always slightly different, always unverifiable, is itself a kind of historical artifact. It tells us that the story was being reshaped almost immediately, that Naples in the years after 1345 was a city full of people who wanted the murder explained, and who were willing to supply the missing pieces themselves when the official record refused to. There is also the matter of the window. Andrew's body, according to the near contemporary sources, was found in the garden below the corridor, where he was strangled, thrown from the window after the killing was completed. Some later accounts insist the window was too small, or positioned wrongly, for a single attacker to have managed the task alone, implying a larger group than official records acknowledged, or a level of coordination that suggests planning far more extensive than a spontaneous act of court violence. Architectural historians who have examined the surviving structure and its later renovations remain divided on whether this detail holds up, or whether it is simply another embellishment added by chroniclers writing for dramatic effect, decades removed from the event, and with every incentive to make the crime sound as monstrous and as premeditated as possible. Then there is the question of the warning. Several later sources, again, none contemporary with the murder itself, claim that Andrew had been warned in the days before his death. A letter, a whispered word from a sympathetic servant, an unnamed source within the court who tried to convince him not to travel to Aversa, or at least not to sleep apart from his usual guard. If such a warning existed, it raises an uncomfortable question. How widely known was this plot before it was carried out? A conspiracy known widely enough to generate a warning is a conspiracy with a great many people aware of it, which would mean either an extraordinary web of silence held firm by dozens of courtiers, or a plot far more improvised and porous than the tightly coordinated ambush described in the trial records. Neither possibility sits entirely comfortably with the official account, and beneath all of this sits the largest, least answerable question of all. What did Joanna actually know? It's worth pausing on how strange her position was, even setting aside the murder itself. She was a woman ruling in her own right in an age when queens regnant were vanishingly rare, married to a man whose family and whose pope-backed ambitions threatened to strip her of that authority entirely. If she wanted him gone, she had motive that required no embellishment, no fringe theory, nothing beyond ordinary political self-preservation. And yet the absence of proof against her is just as real as the presence of motive. Two things can be true simultaneously in a case like this: that a person had every reason to want an outcome, and that we have no reliable evidence they brought it about. Medieval Naples and the centuries of historians and storytellers who followed have never quite been willing to sit with that ambiguity. It is far more satisfying, dramatically, to decide she was guilty, or to insist, just as firmly, that she was an innocent victim of a court that never forgave her for holding power a woman wasn't supposed to hold. The trials themselves add one more layer of unresolved strangeness. Pope Clement VI's investigators, arriving from Avignon with what was meant to be a more impartial process than the first Neapolitan inquiry, produced their own set of confessions and executions. A second wave of court figures put to death, some of whom had not been named in the first round at all. Why the discrepancy? Did the second investigation simply uncover conspirators the first had missed? Or did it, under its own pressures, political, financial, the papacy's own interest in how the Angevin succession played out, arrive at a version of events shaped as much by what Avignon needed to be true as by what had actually happened in that corridor in Aversa? We may never know. The documents that would settle the question, if they ever existed in a form clear enough to settle it, have not survived, or were never written down honestly to begin with. What we're left with instead is a scene: a young husband roused from sleep, a corridor, a struggle, a body in a garden, and a queen who would spend the rest of her long and eventful reign trailed by a question she was never forced to answer under oath, and never chose to answer of her own accord. Somewhere in the Castel Nuovo, or in whatever remains of the monastery at Aversa, the stones themselves hold no opinion on the matter. They have simply endured, indifferent, while 6.5 centuries of historians, chroniclers, and storytellers have argued over what happened in the dark on that September night, and over what, if anything, a sleeping queen might have known. Some 400 miles north of that garden in Aversa, across the length of the Italian peninsula, another body would be laid to rest in another city, ruled by another man who had made himself indispensable, and, in the process, indispensable enough to kill. The city is Verona, the year 1329, and the tomb we're looking at now is not hidden in a garden or a corridor, but displayed with almost defiant pride above a church door in the city's center. An equestrian statue, larger than life, showing a warrior on horseback in gilded armor, sword drawn, laughing. This is the Arche Scaligera, the funerary monument of the della Scala family, and the rider immortalized above the entrance to the church of Santa Maria Antica is Cangrande della Scala. Big Dog, the most powerful ruler Verona had ever known, and a man who died so suddenly, so soon after his greatest triumph, that people have been asking why for nearly 700 years. To understand what happened to Cangrande, we first have to understand what he had just accomplished, because the timing of his death is, in many ways, the whole mystery. By the early 14th century, northern Italy was a patchwork of fiercely independent city-states, each ruled by families who had converted wealth and military force into hereditary power, the kind of lordships historians call signori. Among these, the della Scala family of Verona, and Cangrande in particular, had built something unusually formidable. Over nearly 2 decades of rule, Cangrande had expanded Veronese control across the surrounding region, absorbing rival cities through a mixture of alliance, marriage, siege, and outright conquest. He was, by most contemporary accounts, a genuinely gifted commander, bold, generous to allies, ruthless to enemies, and possessed of the kind of personal charisma that made men want to fight for him rather than simply be paid to. Dante Alighieri, exiled from Florence and given shelter at Cangrande's court, would later dedicate the Paradiso to him and praise his liberality in terms unusually warm even for a poet writing to please a patron. In July of 1329, Cangrande achieved the capstone of his career. After a prolonged campaign, the city of Treviso, the last major holdout in the region, surrendered to him. Cangrande entered the city in triumph, completing a dominion that stretched across much of the Veneto, making him unquestionably the most powerful signor in northern Italy. He was 38 years old, at the height of his strength, his reputation, and his territorial ambition. Within days, he was dead. The contemporary chronicles describe a rapid and violent decline. Cangrande fell ill almost immediately after entering Treviso, suffering from severe vomiting, diarrhea, and fever. Some accounts attribute the onset to his having drunk from a contaminated spring while overheated from the campaign. Others mention that he had continued to attend to state business and celebratory audiences despite clearly failing health, driving himself past the point his body could sustain. Within a matter of days, some sources say as few as 3, others closer to a week, the man who had just conquered the last independent city standing between him and total regional dominance was dead. For centuries, this was largely where the story rested. Sudden death by illness, plausible enough given the primitive state of medieval medicine and the unglamorous realities of campaign life. Bad water, exhaustion, the kind of gastrointestinal collapse that killed medieval rulers and peasants alike with grim regularity. Cangrande's death was mourned, his body entombed in the elaborate monument that still stands today, and his territories passed with the usual friction to his nephews. But the story did not stay settled, and what reopened it, remarkably, was not a newly discovered chronicle or a forgotten letter, but modern science arriving nearly 7 centuries after the fact. In 2004, a team of Italian researchers was granted permission to examine the remains interred in the Scala tombs, part of a broader effort to study the health and lives of Verona's medieval rulers, using contemporary forensic techniques. When Cangrande's body was examined, the researchers found something that the medieval chroniclers, for all their attention to his final days, could never have detected: traces of digitalis, the toxic compound found in foxglove, present in his intestinal remains at what the researchers described as levels consistent with poisoning rather than accidental ingestion. This finding did not, on its own, prove murder. Foxglove grows wild across much of Italy, and accidental poisoning from misidentified plants, or even from herbal remedies prepared by well-meaning but poorly informed physicians attempting to treat his fever and stomach ailments, remained entirely plausible explanations. Medieval medicine relied heavily on plant-based treatments, often administered by attendants who had learned their craft through tradition rather than rigorous testing, and it would not have been unheard of for a sick man to be dosed with something intended to help that instead did lasting harm. And yet the timing gives even careful researchers pause. Cangrande died within days of completing the single most significant conquest of his career, the moment at which his power, and the number of people with reason to fear or resent that power, had just reached its peak. A ruler who has just absorbed the last independent city-state in a region does not merely gain territory. He creates instant enemies among everyone who preferred the old order, everyone who had hoped Treviso might hold out, everyone whose own ambitions in the Veneto had just been permanently foreclosed. If ever there were a moment in Cangrande's career when someone might have decided that the conqueror needed to be stopped before his momentum became irreversible, the days following the fall of Treviso would be it. So who, in this telling, might have wanted him dead? The chronicles and later historians have circled around several possibilities, none conclusively proven, each resting on a different reading of the political tensions swirling around Verona at the height of della Scala power. The most frequently discussed candidate is close to home: Mastino II, Cangrande's nephew and one of his designated heirs. Under the succession arrangement Cangrande had established, his territories were to pass to his nephews rather than to any son of his own body. Cangrande, despite multiple marriages, had left no legitimate heir. Mastino II would go on to inherit a substantial share of the della Scala dominions and would rule with an ambition and a ruthlessness that, in the eyes of some historians, retrospectively colors the question of what he might have been willing to do to accelerate his uncle's departure. Succession by a nephew rather than a son was not unusual for the era, but it did mean that Cangrande's death, whenever it came, would trigger an inheritance already earmarked for men who had watched him consolidate ever more power that might otherwise, in a different arrangement, have flowed toward them sooner. Whether impatience curdled into something more deliberate is a question no surviving document answers directly. The case against Mastino, such as it is, rests entirely on motive and opportunity, the same two ingredients that make for suspicion in any era, without the confession or witness testimony that might turn suspicion into proof. A second thread of speculation looks outward, toward the cities and rivals Cangrande had spent 2 decades subduing. Treviso itself had just fallen. Its former rulers and loyalists had every reason to want the conqueror removed before he could fully consolidate his hold on their city. Padua, another city that had felt the weight of della Scala expansion in years prior, harbored its own grievances. And beyond individual cities, the wider political tapestry of Guelph and Ghibelline allegiances, the long-running factional divide between those aligned with the papacy and those aligned with imperial authority, which shaped and poisoned nearly every Italian political relationship of the period, meant that Cangrande, a committed Ghibelline and imperial vicar, had enemies whose objections to him were ideological as much as personal. Any of these parties might have found a way to place someone close enough to the dying ruler to administer a slow-acting poison disguised as medicine, though again, might have, is doing a great deal of work in a case with no surviving accusation, no trial, and no confession from anyone at all. There is also a third possibility, quieter and less dramatic than either conspiracy theory, but worth taking seriously precisely because it requires no villain at all. That the digitalis entered Cangrande's system exactly the way medieval medicine might produce such a thing by accident. Foxglove derivatives, in carefully controlled doses, were sometimes used in period herbal medicine for cardiac and other ailments, and a physician attempting to treat a feverish, vomiting patient with what was believed to be a restorative or fever-reducing preparation could easily have miscalculated a dose or used a preparation contaminated with a more concentrated form of the plant than intended. Under this reading, Cangrande wasn't murdered at all. He was, in effect, a casualty of the medicine meant to save him, his death the result of an era in which the line between remedy and poison was thinner and far less precisely drawn than we assume today. This explanation lacks the drama of a nephew's ambition or a conquered city's revenge, but it has the virtue of requiring no hidden hand, only the ordinary hazards of 14th century care. What makes the Cangrande case distinct from many medieval murder mysteries is this unusual collision of eras, a death shrouded in the limited diagnostic vocabulary of the 14th century, reopened 700 years later by toxicological methods. The chroniclers who recorded his final illness could never have imagined. The 2004 findings didn't hand historians a solved case. They handed them a new, more precisely worded version of the same old question. Not, did he die of illness or something else, but was the digitalis administered by design, by well-intentioned error, or through some accident of contaminated water or food that no one at the time thought to investigate more closely than a bad spring? And there is a further wrinkle worth sitting with. Even if we accept that digitalis killed him, we still don't know how it entered his body, who, if anyone, placed it there, or whether it was delivered once, in a single fatal dose, or gradually over the course of his final illness, disguised as treatment for symptoms it may have itself been causing. A single poisoning event and a slow accumulation through repeated medicinal dosing would look similar in a body examined 7 centuries later, but they imply very different stories. One, a single decisive act. The other, something closer to weeks of failed treatment mistaken by everyone present, poisoner and physician and victim alike, for the ordinary unpredictability of a serious illness. It's worth pausing on what the equestrian statue above Santa Maria Antica actually shows us, in light of all this. Cangrande is depicted laughing, a strange, almost unsettling choice for a funerary monument, more often associated with triumph than mourning. Art historians read it as a deliberate statement by his successors. This was how Verona wished to remember him, not as a man cut down in suspicious circumstances at the height of his power, but as a conqueror eternally victorious, untouched by the manner of his ending. If Mastino II did have a hand in his uncle's death, commissioning such a monument would have been either a remarkable act of guilt-driven tribute or a calculated piece of political theater, burying any hint of foul play beneath gilded bronze and a permanent laughing face turned toward the city he'd just finished conquering. We are left, then, with a body examined twice, once by physicians in 1329 who could describe his symptoms but not their cause, and once by scientists in 2004 who could name the poison but not the hand, if there was a hand, that delivered it. Between those two examinations lie nearly 700 years of chronicles, tombs, family rivalries, and a city that has never quite decided whether its greatest ruler died a victim of 14th century medicine or 14th century ambition. The statue above the church door is still laughing. It has been laughing since 1329 through every theory advanced and abandoned in the centuries since, giving away nothing. Perhaps that's fitting for a man whose final days remain this contested. A conqueror who took Treviso and then, within a week, took his own secret with him, leaving behind a tomb, a toxin, and a question that modern science could only sharpen, never answer. Who, if anyone, wanted Cangrande della Scala to die exactly when he did? Who wanted him gone, and how many hands were willing to make sure of it? That question, still unanswered in the laughing bronze face above a church door in Verona, finds an even darker echo now, in a city under siege, where an emperor would rise and fall within the span of a single winter, and vanish from history so completely that even his enemies would later struggle to agree on exactly how and precisely where his story ended. The object at the center of this chapter no longer exists. It stood once in the Forum of Theodosius in Constantinople, a towering column nearly 150 feet high, wrapped from base to capital in a carved spiral relief depicting the Emperor Theodosius's military triumphs, crowned with a bronze statue of the emperor himself. For 8 centuries it had dominated that stretch of the city's main thoroughfare, a monument to imperial permanence in a city that called itself, with some justification, the eternal capital of Rome's eastern half. The column is gone now, toppled by earthquakes and centuries of demolition, its foundations buried somewhere beneath modern Istanbul's streets. But in the spring of 1204, it was still standing, and it was about to become the site of one of the strangest executions in Byzantine history. The final, still debated chapter in the brief, chaotic reign of the Emperor Alexios V. To understand how a man could rise to the throne of the Byzantine Empire and fall from a column in the same season, we need to understand just how fractured Constantinople had become by the time he seized power. By early 1204, the city had already been humiliated once. The armies of the Fourth Crusade, originally raised at least nominally to retake Jerusalem, had been diverted to Constantinople the previous year, drawn in by a Byzantine succession dispute and the promise of enormous payment from a pretender to the throne named Alexios IV, who wanted Crusader muscle to help install him and his blind father, Isaac II, as co-emperors. The Crusaders obliged, the city was besieged and partially occupied, and Alexios IV was duly crowned alongside his father. But the promised payment never fully materialized. The imperial treasury simply didn't hold what Alexios IV had promised. And by the winter of 1204, the arrangement had curdled into something venomous. The Crusader army sat camped outside walls it had already breached once, increasingly hostile to a co-emperor who could neither pay his debts nor control his own capital, while the population of Constantinople grew to despise Alexios IV as a puppet who had sold his city's independence for a throne he couldn't actually hold. It was into this collapsing arrangement that Alexios Doukas stepped. A court official known by the nickname Moursouflos, a reference, most sources agree, to his notably heavy or joined eyebrows. He had served under the very emperors he would soon depose, positioning himself as a leader of the anti-Latin faction within the palace. In late January 1204, as popular fury against Alexios IV boiled over into open riot, Murtzouphlos moved. He had the young emperor arrested and, according to the Byzantine historian Nikitas Choniates, who lived through these events and remains our single most detailed contemporary witness, imprisoned and eventually strangled. Isaac II, the blind former emperor, died within days as well, of causes the sources describe only vaguely, whether from illness, shock, or something more deliberate. Murtzouphlos was crowned Alexios IV. He inherited, in other words, a throne built entirely out of other men's ruin, a capital half occupied by a foreign army it could no longer pay off, a population exhausted by 2 changes of ruler in a matter of months, and an empire whose finances and military strength had been hollowed out by the very succession crisis he had just resolved through murder. Whatever else can be said about Alexios V, his brief reign was not born of stability. It was born of an emergency, seized by a man who seems to have genuinely believed, and here the mainstream and more speculative readings of his character begin to diverge, that only decisive, ruthless leadership could save Constantinople from the army camped at its gates. To his credit, in the weeks that followed, Alexios V did attempt exactly that. He worked to repair the city's fortifications, reorganized its defense, and personally led sorties against Crusader positions, at one point reportedly fighting hard enough in a skirmish outside the walls to have his horse wounded beneath him. Choniates, who was no particular admirer of the man, nonetheless credits him with more energy and competence than either of his immediate predecessors had shown. For a brief window in February and March of 1204, it's possible to imagine an alternate history in which Alexios V's harder line actually held the city. It didn't. On the 12th of April 1204, the Crusader army breached the walls in a final, overwhelming assault, and Constantinople, a city that had not fallen to a foreign army in the 9 centuries of its existence as the Roman Empire's eastern capital, was taken and given over to a sack so thorough and so destructive that it remains, to this day, one of the defining catastrophes of medieval history. Alexios V did not stay to be captured. He fled the city that same night. And this is where the documented mainstream account of his reign ends, and the far stranger, harder to untangle story of his final months begins. Alexios V's flight took him first to Mousinopolis, in Thrace, where he crossed paths with a man whose presence in this story adds a genuinely uncomfortable layer of irony. The former Emperor Alexios III, the very ruler who had originally blinded and imprisoned his own brother Isaac II years earlier, setting the entire chain of succession crises in motion to begin with. Alexios III had also fled Constantinople months earlier, during the Crusaders' first siege, taking with him what remained of the imperial treasury he could carry. Now the 2 men, one deposed, one a fugitive from the throne he'd only just seized, found themselves thrown together as refugees from the same collapsed empire. What happened next is documented, but it's worth sitting with how strange it actually is. Alexios III, rather than treating the younger man as a fellow victim of the Crusaders' conquest, apparently saw in him either a rival for whatever remained of imperial legitimacy, or simply a convenient scapegoat to offer up in exchange for goodwill. His own position, or perhaps a marriage alliance with his daughter Eudokia, who had been married to Alexios V during this period of shared flight. Whatever the calculation, Alexios III had his son-in-law seized and blinded, a punishment with deep symbolic weight in Byzantine political culture, understood by everyone involved as a permanent disqualification from ever holding the throne again, since a blinded man could not, by long custom, legitimately rule. Why would a father-in-law blind the husband of his own daughter, a fellow refugee from the same catastrophe, a man who had, if anything, fought harder against the common enemy than Alexios III himself had managed to during his own reign? The sources offer motive without offering certainty. Was it envy? A bitter former emperor unable to tolerate a rival's greater competence? Was it calculation, an attempt to remove a potential competitor for whatever fragments of Byzantine authority might still be reassembled in the empire's fractured aftermath? Or was it, as some read it, an attempt to curry favor with the Latins themselves, a signal that Alexios III had no loyalty left to the man most directly associated with defying the Crusader army, offered in hopes of easier treatment for himself? Choniates doesn't fully resolve the question, and no other contemporary source does either. We're left with an act of startling cruelty, committed by one desperate, dispossessed emperor against another, for reasons that remain, 7 centuries later, essentially a matter of informed guesswork. Blind and effectively powerless, Alexios V did not vanish into obscurity, though one senses he might have preferred to. He was captured not long afterward. By whom exactly, and under what precise circumstances, the sources again disagree in their details, and brought back to Constantinople, now firmly under Latin occupation, to face the men who had conquered it. What followed was, by medieval standards, an unusually theatrical form of justice. The Crusader leadership and the Venetian contingent that had backed the invasion held what amounted to a trial, and the charge leveled against Alexios I was not, as one might expect, treason against a foreign power or crimes against the Crusader army directly. It was the murder of Alexios IV, the young co-emperor Mortzuflos had deposed and strangled the previous winter. This is worth pausing on, because it's a strange choice of charge. The Crusaders had, after all, just spent months besieging and violently sacking Constantinople. They were hardly positioned as impartial guardians of Byzantine legal order. And yet framing the execution around Alexios IV's murder allowed them to cast the punishment as an act of justice rather than simple conquest. Retribution for the killing of a ruler who had, however disastrously, been their own ally and debtor. Whether the Crusader leadership genuinely cared about avenging Alexios IV, or whether the charge was simply the most convenient available pretext for disposing of a man who represented the last real symbol of Byzantine resistance, is a question the sources leave open, and one that later historians have never fully settled. The sentence, when it came, matched the strangeness of everything that preceded it. Rather than a conventional execution, Alexios V was taken to that column in the Forum of Theodosius. The same column, towering with its carved spiral of imperial military triumphs, and thrown from its summit to his death. Even here, in an event witnessed by a considerable crowd and recorded by multiple chroniclers, the details refuse to fully align. Nikitas Choniates describes the execution with a kind of grim, almost reluctant admiration for how the doomed emperor faced it, noting the irony, sharp enough that Choniates himself remarks on it, of a man plunging to his death from a monument built to celebrate imperial victory, in full view of a city that had once been his to rule and was now occupied by the very army he had fought so hard, and for a while so effectively, to keep out. The French chronicler Robert of Clary, writing from the Crusader side, gives a somewhat different emphasis, focused more on the spectacle and the crowd's reaction than on any interior reflection. Geoffrey of Villardouin, another Crusader chronicler and a far more central figure in the campaign's leadership, treats the execution almost as a footnote, a piece of tidying up after the real business of conquest had already been settled. 3 eyewitness traditions, 3 subtly different emphases, and no complete agreement on exactly how the crowd reacted, what Alexios V said or didn't say in his final moments, or precisely what became of his remains afterward. That last detail is, in its own quiet way, the most genuinely mysterious element of the entire episode. Byzantine and Crusader chroniclers alike were often meticulous about recording the burial or disposal of prominent bodies. Where an emperor's remains were interred carried real political and religious weight, marking legitimacy or its absence. For Alexios V, that record simply isn't there. No source describes what happened to his body once it was recovered from the base of the column, whether it received any burial rites at all, whether it was interred somewhere in the city, or whether, in the chaos of an occupied and still smoldering Constantinople, it was simply disposed of without ceremony, unrecorded because no one left to write the history considered it worth the ink. For an empire that had spent 9 centuries carefully documenting the deaths and burials of its emperors, the silence surrounding Alexios V's remains is conspicuous. It leaves us with a reign that lasted barely 2 months, a man who rose through calculated brutality and arguably ruled with more genuine competence than either of the emperors he displaced, and an ending that, for all its public spectacle, a crowd, a column, an emperor cast down from the very monument built to celebrate imperial power, still manages to dissolve into uncertainty at nearly every turn. We don't fully know why his own father-in-law chose to blind him rather than protect him. We don't fully know whether his trial was a genuine reckoning for Alexios IV's murder or simply theater dressed up as justice. And we don't know at all what became of him once the crowd in the Forum of Theodosius had dispersed, and the column resumed its long, silent watch over a city that would not fully belong to Byzantine rule again for nearly 6 decades. The column itself is gone now, its stones scattered or buried somewhere beneath the streets of modern Istanbul, its exact former footprint a matter of some scholarly reconstruction rather than certainty. Perhaps that feels fitting. An emperor who rose in the space of a riot, ruled in the space of a siege, and fell from a monument that has since vanished as completely as the empire he briefly, fiercely tried to save. What, if anything, might still be buried beneath that same ground, waiting to tell us the parts of this story that Choniats, Clery, and Villehardouin each chose, for their own reasons, to leave out. Far from the caravel decks and salt-stained charts of the last chapter, the story now carries us inland, away from the coastlines that so obsessed the mapmakers of Lisbon, and into a country few Europeans had ever seen with their own eyes. Here, in the high plateau of the Ethiopian interior, ringed by mountains the color of rust, and by rivers that vanish into gorges deep enough to swallow a cathedral, our story settles into a different kind of silence. Not the silence of an empty sea, but the silence of a man who walked into history's brightest light, and then, for 30 years, simply stopped being heard from. His name was Pero de Covilhã, and what happened to him remains one of the most quietly unsettling mysteries of the Age of Discovery. Picture a leather satchel, cracked and sun-bleached, its stitching long since rotted through by highland rain. Inside it, had it survived, which it did not, there might have been letters bearing the seal of King John II of Portugal, instructions written in the careful hand of royal secretaries, perhaps even a rough sketch of a coastline glimpsed from the deck of an Arab dhow somewhere off the Malabar coast. That satchel, real or imagined, is as close as we can come to touching the physical trace of a man who crossed more of the known world alone than perhaps any other European of his century, and who vanished from it almost entirely. We know how the story begins. In 1487, as Portugal's captains were inching their way down the West African coast in search of a route to the riches of the Indies, King John II summoned 2 men to his court for a mission unlike any attempted before. One was Afonso de Paiva. The other was Pero de Covilhã, a minor nobleman from the town of Covilhã, fluent in Arabic, seasoned in diplomacy, a man who had already served the crown in Castile and North Africa as something between a courtier and a spy. Their task was extraordinary in its simplicity and terrifying in its scope: travel overland in disguise through the Islamic world and discover 2 things that had haunted European imaginations for centuries. First, the true source of the spices that flowed into Mediterranean markets at extraordinary prices: the cinnamon, the pepper, the cloves whose origins were wrapped in rumor and myth. And second, the location of a fabled Christian king said to rule somewhere beyond the lands of Islam. A monarch European chroniclers had been calling for nearly 300 years: Prester John. It is worth pausing on how audacious this was. This was not an armed expedition. It was 2 men, dressed as merchants, carrying letters of credit and a command of Arabic good enough to pass unnoticed among traders who would have killed them without hesitation had they been discovered as Christian agents. They left Santarém in May of 1487. They would travel through Barcelona, Naples, Rhodes, Alexandria, Cairo. And here, only a few months into the journey, we encounter the first hint of what would become a pattern: divergence, disappearance, uncertainty about who went where and why. At Aden, on the southern tip of the Arabian Peninsula, the two men parted ways. Afonso de Paiva would head toward Ethiopia in search of Prester John. Pero de Covilhã would continue on, deeper into the trading world of the Indian Ocean, to trace the spice routes to their source. It was the last time the two men would see each other. De Paiva would later die. Where exactly and under what circumstances remains disputed by the very sources that report it. And Covilhã would go on alone, into a region where the record of his movements becomes, for long stretches, maddeningly thin. What we do know reads like something between a merchant's ledger and an explorer's fever dream. Covilhã sailed to Calicut and Goa on the Indian coast, gathering intelligence on the pepper trade that would, within a decade, reshape the entire economic order of Europe. He crossed to Hormuz, at the mouth of the Persian Gulf, a city that controlled the flow of goods between Persia and the sea. He traveled down the East African coast, visiting Sofala, a port so laden with gold that Arab traders spoke of it as the true source of the wealth that had built the great city-states of the Swahili coast. Some accounts claim he even heard, this far south, rumors of a land beyond, a hint, decades before Portuguese ships would round the Cape of Good Hope, that Africa's coastline curved back north toward a passage into another ocean entirely. And then, most audaciously of all, and this is where the historical record grows genuinely uncertain, there are accounts suggesting Covilhã traveled to Mecca and Medina, disguised, undetected, a Christian spy walking through the holiest sites of Islam at a time when discovery would have meant certain death. Did this actually happen? The sources are not unanimous. Some later chroniclers report it as established fact. Others treat it as embellishment, the kind of detail that accretes around a legend the way pearl accretes around grit. We are, quite early in this story, already standing on the boundary between documented history and something closer to folklore, and Covilhã himself, the only man who could settle the question with certainty, left us no memoir of his own making. Everything we know about these years comes secondhand, filtered through the accounts of others, written down long after the fact. By around 1490, having completed this extraordinary circuit of intelligence gathering, Covilhã made a decision that would define the rest of his life. Rather than returning immediately to Portugal, he sent a detailed report back with 2 Jewish merchants he encountered in Cairo. A report that, remarkably, did make it home, and that some historians believe directly informed Vasco da Gama's eventual route around Africa to India nearly a decade later. Having dispatched this intelligence, Covilhã did not go home. He turned south, into Ethiopia, to complete the second half of his original mission, to find Prester John. And this is where he disappears. Not literally, not into a jungle, not off the edge of a map. He disappears in a stranger, slower way. He arrives at the court of the Ethiopian emperor, likely Iskender, and is received with the elaborate hospitality that the Highland Kingdom extended to foreign visitors of standing. And then he simply stays. Records suggest he was treated with honor, granted land, married into a local family by some accounts, given a position of some respect within the court. But he was not permitted to leave. Consider what that means. A man sent across the known world by his king, tasked with returning vital intelligence, succeeds beyond anything anyone could have reasonably expected, and then vanishes into a kind of gilded captivity, so complete that Portugal would not hear another confirmed word from him for over 3 decades. Why would a kingdom that received him so warmly refuse to let him leave? The mainstream historical explanation is almost mundane in its plausibility, and worth sitting with before we wander further afield. Highland Ethiopian custom, as recorded by multiple travelers of the period, held that foreigners of value, particularly those with useful skills, knowledge, or connections, were not permitted to depart once they had entered royal service. This was not necessarily cruelty. It may have functioned as a kind of honor, even a compliment. You have proven too valuable to lose. Other European travelers who reached the Ethiopian court in this era reported similar treatment. Covilhã was not uniquely persecuted. He was, perhaps, simply caught in a diplomatic custom that Lisbon had no framework to anticipate and no leverage to challenge. And yet, if it was truly that simple, a known custom, a predictable outcome, why does the silence around Covilhã stretch as long as it does? Why do we have no letters from him during these decades, no fragments smuggled out with traders the way his earlier report had been? He had proven, by getting that first report to Cairo, that he understood how to move information across impossible distances. Why does that skill seem to abandon him the moment he crosses into Ethiopia? This is where the documented history begins to thin into something more like sediment. Layers of second-hand report, each one a little further from the source. The man who eventually rediscovers Covilhã is a Portuguese priest named Francisco Alvares, chaplain to a Portuguese diplomatic mission that finally reaches the Ethiopian court in 1520, 33 years after Covilhã first departed Santarém. And what Alvares finds, and later records in his chronicle, is almost eerie in its quiet strangeness. Covilhã is alive. He is, by this point, an old man, still living within the Ethiopian court, still fluent in the languages of his youth, still, by Alvarez's account, deeply eager to speak of Portugal, to hear news of a homeland he has not seen in over 3 decades. Alvarez describes him as a figure of unusual standing at court, trusted, respected, apparently wealthy by local measure, married with children who had never known any home but the Ethiopian highlands. And crucially, Alvarez reports that when the new Portuguese delegation prepared to return home, the reigning emperor, by this time Dawit II, sometimes called Lebna Dengel, refused once again to let Covilhã go. Sit with that for a moment. 2 separate rulers, across a span of over 30 years, independently reached the same conclusion. This man does not leave. Whatever explanation we favor for the first refusal has to somehow also account for the second, made by a different monarch a full generation later to a man who was by then elderly and, one would think, of diminishing strategic value. Was Covilhã really so useful that his knowledge remained irreplaceable across 2 reigns? Or had something else happened in those intervening decades? Had he become something other than a captive, so integrated into Ethiopian court life that the idea of a Portuguese rescue no longer quite applied to him? Some historians have raised precisely this possibility, that by the time Alvarez arrived, Covilhã himself may have been ambivalent about leaving. A man with a family, land, status, and 3 decades of a life built somewhere other than the country that sent him, does such a man necessarily still long for the ship home? Alvarez's account gives us Covilhã's professed eagerness to hear of Portugal, but professed eagerness to hear news of a place is not the same as a documented wish to return to it. We are once again relying entirely on the perception of an outside observer, recorded years after the fact, about the inner life of a man history otherwise leaves silent. It's worth noting, too, how selectively the record treats Covilhã compared to his lost companion, Afonso de Paiva. De Paiva is generally reported to have died somewhere in Ethiopia before ever completing his portion of the mission. But even this fact rests on second-hand testimony, gathered well after the supposed event, with no grave, no first-hand account, no corroborating detail beyond the word passed along the same merchant networks that carried Covilhã's own report to Cairo. 2 men set out together on one of the most dangerous intelligence missions of their era. One is said to have died quietly, off the page. The other is said to have lived for over 3 decades in a captivity so comfortable that a priest who finally located him described him less as a prisoner and more as a nobleman who happened to be far from home. Does that discrepancy trouble you at all? It should, at least a little, not because either account is necessarily false, but because both rest on such thin evidentiary ground that we are, in a sense, being asked to believe two very different fates on the strength of travelers' tales passed hand to hand across a continent. From here, if we are willing to step further from the documented center of the story and into its speculative margins, other questions begin to surface. The kind that responsible historians raise cautiously, if at all, but that the shape of the evidence nonetheless invites. Was Covilhã, over those 33 years, still functioning as an intelligence source for Portugal in some capacity we simply have no surviving record of? He had proven, in getting his Cairo report home, that information could move even when its bearer could not. Is it possible, not proven, but possible, that fragments of what he learned in Ethiopia found their way back to Lisbon through channels history never documented, shaping Portuguese strategy in the Indian Ocean in ways no chronicler ever attributed to him by name? Portugal's sudden, remarkably well-informed aggression in the region in the early 16th century has long invited questions about the depth of intelligence behind it. Covilhã's report is credited with part of that picture. Could a silent, decades-long continuation of that same intelligence work be part of it too? There is no direct evidence for this, but there is also, tellingly, no evidence against it, only an absence. And absences of this kind have a way of inviting speculation precisely because they cannot be closed. Then there is the more fringe possibility, the one that sits furthest from mainstream historical consensus, but that inevitably arises whenever a European figure disappears for decades into a foreign court and later resurfaces fluent, integrated, and reluctant to leave. Did Covilhã, at some point in those 33 years, simply stop being an agent of Portugal at all, in any meaningful sense? Did his loyalties, his identity, his very sense of home quietly relocate? Some writers, reading between the lines of Alvarez's account, have wondered whether the captivity framing itself is a distortion, a story Portugal needed to tell about a man who might otherwise have been understood to have chosen, freely, a different life. A king spy who stopped being a spy and became instead something history had no ready category for. We cannot know. And that, ultimately, is the strange, quiet core of this mystery. Not a body, not a lost ship, not a coded message waiting to be cracked, but a life that continued, undeniably, in full view of an entire royal court for over 3 decades, while remaining almost entirely invisible to the country that sent him there. Pero de Covilhã did not vanish into a desert or a sea. He vanished into full sight, into the ordinary daily record of a foreign kingdom that simply had no reason to write his story down for Portuguese eyes. And even when a Portuguese chronicler finally did find him and did write him down, the account raises nearly as many questions as it resolves. He would, by most accounts, die in Ethiopia. An old man, decades removed from the court that had once entrusted him with one of the most ambitious intelligence missions in Portuguese history. No grave marker survives that we can point to with certainty. No final letter home. The man who helped make possible the sea route that would reshape global trade for centuries spends the final act of his own story almost entirely off the page, in a kingdom whose motives for keeping him we can only partially reconstruct. Living a life we can only partially imagine. So we are left, as we so often are with mysteries of this kind, not with an answer, but with a shape. The outline of a man traced by the handful of documents that happened to survive, surrounded on all sides by the much larger darkness of what was never written down at all. Was Pero de Covilhã a captive, an honored guest, a willing exile, or something that shifted between all three across 33 quiet years? Did his knowledge continue to serve a crown he never saw again? Or did that knowledge simply end with him, sealed inside a life that had become, by the time anyone came looking, entirely his own? Perhaps the most honest thing we can say is this. Somewhere in the Ethiopian highlands, in soil that has never been definitively identified, lies a man who once walked disguised through the holiest cities of Islam, who mapped the spice trade of an ocean no European had yet dared to cross alone, and who then simply stopped being heard from. Not because he died, and not because he was lost, but because the world he had entered no longer needed to explain itself to the one he had left behind. What else did he see, in those 33 silent years? What did he choose to tell, and what did he choose, perhaps deliberately, to let disappear with him? Imagine for a moment the sound of a door closing softly in the dark. Not slammed, not forced, but eased shut by someone who does not want to be heard. Imagine candlelight guttering in a chamber, a woman's breathing keeping quiet beneath silk sheets that are not her own, and then footsteps, not hers. This is the sound with which our next mystery begins. A quiet January night in Florence, in the year 1537, inside a palace where a duke believed himself entirely safe. He would not survive until morning. Florence in the 1530s was a city still adjusting to a new and uncomfortable shape of power. For nearly 3 centuries, the Florentine Republic had prided itself, at least in principle, on a system of elected councils, guilds, and civic institutions. A city that, however imperfect and however often dominated behind the scenes by the Medici family, had never formally bent the knee to a single hereditary ruler. That changed in 1532 when Pope Clement VII, himself a Medici, engineered the transformation of Florence into a hereditary duchy and placed at its head a young man named Alessandro de' Medici. Alessandro was, from the very beginning, a figure who unsettled as much as he ruled. He was almost certainly the son of Lorenzo II de' Medici, Duke of Urbino, though even this was, and remains, a matter of some historical debate. Some contemporaries and later historians have suggested his father may instead have been Clement VII himself, fathering him before he took holy orders. His mother, meanwhile, is widely believed to have been an enslaved or formerly enslaved woman of African descent, likely from North Africa, employed within the Medici household. This ancestry made Alessandro, by most accounts, the first person of documented African heritage to rule a major European state, a fact that shaped how he was perceived by allies and enemies alike, and one that later chroniclers, both sympathetic and hostile, would seize upon for very different purposes. By the time he took power, Florence had already spent generations accustomed to Medici influence wielded quietly, through patronage, marriage, and banking, a soft hand disguised as Republican civic life. Alessandro's dukedom removed the disguise entirely. He ruled not as first citizen, but as sovereign, with the formal backing of the Pope and, crucially, the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, whose illegitimate daughter Margaret he married in 1536 to cement the alliance. To his supporters, he represented order restored after decades of Republican instability and factional violence. To his enemies, and he had many, drawn especially from Florence's old aristocratic families and a faction of exiled Republicans who had never accepted the duchy's legitimacy, he represented something closer to tyranny. A young ruler, contemporaries alleged, given to excess, to the seduction of the city's noblewomen, and to a court culture that many found decadent and threatening to the very idea of Florentine liberty. It is against this backdrop, a city simmering with resentment beneath a surface of enforced order, that we arrive at the night of January 6, 1537. The known facts, insofar as they can be called known, run as follows. Alessandro's closest companion at court was his cousin, Lorenzino de' Medici, a young nobleman known for his sharp wit, his literary ambitions, and a reputation, even among contemporaries, for a certain unsettling coldness beneath his charm. Lorenzino had, over the preceding months, cultivated an unusually intimate friendship with the Duke, one that gave him access few others enjoyed. On the night in question, Lorenzino reportedly told Alessandro that he had arranged an assignation, a secret meeting with a noblewoman the Duke had long desired, said in most accounts to be Lorenzino's own sister, or by some versions his aunt, Caterina Soderini Ginori. The details of exactly who this woman was supposed to be shift depending on which chronicler you read, and this uncertainty is itself worth noting. Even the bait used to lure a sitting head of state to his death is not something history can state with full confidence. Alessandro, by every account, went eagerly. He dismissed his guards, undressed, and lay down to wait in a chamber within the Medici palace. trusting, apparently without hesitation, the cousin who had arranged the meeting. What happened next has been described so many times by so many hands that it has taken on the texture of legend, even though it is, at its core, a documented assassination. Lorenzino returned to the chamber not with the promised woman, but with a hired swordsman, a man named Michele del Tavolacino, sometimes called Scoronconcolo. According to the most widely accepted account, Lorenzino himself struck the first blow, wounding the Duke, before the two men together overpowered him in a violent, prolonged struggle. Alessandro fought back. He was, by most physical descriptions, a strong and capable young man. And the fight was neither quick nor clean. He was eventually killed by multiple sword wounds, and in some versions, finished with a dagger to the throat. The body was hidden, rolled in a carpet or a cloak, depending on the source, and concealed within the chamber for hours while Lorenzino fled the city under cover of night, riding first to Bologna and then onward, eventually finding refuge in Venice, a republic that, not incidentally, had its own long history of hostility toward Medici power. On its surface, this appears to be one of the more thoroughly explained political murders of the Italian Renaissance. We know, with reasonable confidence, who wielded the blade. We know the motive most often cited. Lorenzino's own writings, produced years later while he lived in exile, framed the killing not as a personal betrayal, but as an act of political liberation. A modern Brutus striking down a modern Caesar to free Florence from tyranny. He titled his self-justifying account, tellingly, The Apologia, and in it he cast himself deliberately in the mold of the classical tyrannicide, invoking the language and imagery of Republican Rome to elevate what might otherwise look like a squalid, intimate betrayal into an act of high political philosophy. And yet the closer one looks at this case, the more the tidy narrative begins to fray at its edges. Consider first the strangeness of the friendship itself. Lorenzino was not merely an acquaintance of the Duke's. He was, by all accounts, one of his most trusted intimates, someone who had free access to Alessandro's private chambers, who dined with him, who was privy to his personal affairs to a degree that few others at court could claim. What kind of relationship allows a man to spend months, even years, in close and apparently genuine companionship with someone he is quietly planning to kill? Was Lorenzino's affection for his cousin ever real, later curdling into resentment or ideological conviction? Or was the entire friendship, from its outset, a long and patient performance, years of intimacy cultivated for the sole purpose of one night's access? Lorenzino's own later writings insist on the latter, framing his closeness to Alessandro as calculated proximity in service of liberty. But we should ask, how much of the Apologia can we trust as a truthful account of motive, and how much of it is retrospective myth-making, an exiled man crafting the most flattering possible story of his own crime, years after the fact, for an audience he needed to convince? This question of motive is where the mystery genuinely deepens, because the political liberation narrative, however elegantly Lorenzino dressed it in the language of Brutus and Caesar, does not fully account for what happened after the murder. If this truly was an act of civic liberation, intended to free Florence from ducal rule and restore the Republic, we would expect it to have been followed, or at least accompanied, by some coordinated uprising, some Republican faction ready to seize the moment. It was not. Florence, in the days after Alessandro's death, did not rise up. Instead, the city's ruling council, working quickly and with what looks, in hindsight, like considerable pre-existing preparation, moved to install another Medici, the young Cosimo I, as the new duke, with the backing of the same imperial and aristocratic interests that had propped up Alessandro in the first place. The republic Lorenzino claimed to be fighting for never materialized. The dynasty he claimed to be ending did not end. It simply changed hands, and would go on to rule Florence, and eventually all of Tuscany, for more than 2 centuries afterward. Does that outcome sit comfortably alongside the story of a principled tyrannicide? Or does it suggest something else? That Lorenzino's stated motive, however sincerely he may have believed it himself, may not be the whole picture. That other hands, other interests within or beyond Florence, may have found the removal of Alessandro convenient for reasons having little to do with Republican liberty at all. This is where historians, and generations of more speculative writers after them, have found room to wonder. Some have pointed to the deep and long-simmering resentment among Florence's old aristocratic families, who had never fully accepted a duke they regarded as illegitimate, both in his claim to rule and, more troublingly to many of them, in his very bloodline. A prejudice inseparable from the racial attitudes of the era, given Alessandro's African ancestry, and one that colored how contemporaries described him even in accounts otherwise sympathetic to his rule. Was Lorenzino acting entirely alone, as his own account insists, or was he, knowingly or not, the instrument of a broader faction that found it useful to let a single dramatic act of liberation stand in for what was, underneath, a far more calculated and coordinated removal of an inconvenient ruler? No document has ever surfaced proving such a conspiracy. But the speed and coordination with which Cosimo I's succession was arranged in the days immediately following the murder has struck more than one historian as difficult to square with the image of a spontaneous, solitary act of tyrannicide followed by chaos. There is a second thread worth pulling, and it concerns Lorenzino's fate rather than Alessandro's. Having fled to Venice and lived there under an uneasy kind of celebrity, praised by some Republican exiles as a hero, reviled by Medici loyalists as a murderer, Lorenzino was himself assassinated in 1548, 11 years after the killing of Alessandro, cut down in the streets of Venice by agents believed to have been sent by Cosimo I in a long-delayed act of vengeance. This too is generally accepted as documented fact, and it closes the story with a certain grim narrative symmetry. The assassin, in the end, assassinated. But it also means that the one man who could have told us definitively what truly happened in that chamber on the night of January 6th. Whether the plot was his alone, whether it had backers, whether the political justification came before the act or was constructed carefully afterward to explain it, was silenced permanently more than a decade later, before any fuller account could ever be extracted from him under less self-serving circumstances than his own apologia. We are left then with a written record produced almost entirely by two motivated parties: Lorenzino himself, writing in exile to justify his actions to history, and the Medici court that succeeded Alessandro, which had every incentive to frame the killing as the isolated act of a treacherous, deluded murderer, rather than evidence of any wider conspiracy against ducal rule. Between these two competing narratives, hero of liberty on one side, monstrous betrayer on the other, the actual texture of what happened, and why, becomes strangely difficult to grasp with any confidence. Even something as basic as the identity of the woman used as bait shifts from source to source. Even the precise sequence of the killing, who struck first, how long the struggle lasted, whether Alessandro cried out, and if so, whether anyone heard him, varies between the accounts that have come down to us, each shaped by the sympathies of whoever was doing the telling. And beneath all of this lies a further, quieter question that histories of Alessandro's murder often touch only briefly. How much did his race shape both the resentment that made him a target and the way his death was subsequently narrated? Contemporary chroniclers hostile to Alessandro frequently folded commentary on his ancestry into their criticism of his character, using it as shorthand for illegitimacy in a way that had nothing to do with the actual facts of his paternity and everything to do with the prejudices of the age. Later, historians have had to work carefully to separate documented fact from the racially inflected caricature that grew up around his memory almost immediately after his death. A caricature that made it easier, perhaps, for contemporaries to accept Lorenzino's self-portrait as noble liberator, striking down not merely a duke but a ruler many were already primed, for reasons having nothing to do with his governance, to see as somehow illegitimate. How much of what we think we know about Alessandro's character, the accusations of excess, of cruelty, of moral corruption that Lorenzino's apologia leans on so heavily to justify the killing, reflects the historical man, and how much reflects the lens through which his enemies, then and later, chose to view him? We should be careful here not to overcorrect into a different kind of certainty, to assume conspiracy simply because the official story is imperfect, or to assume Alessandro was purely a victim of prejudice simply because prejudice undeniably shaped how he was remembered. The honest position, the one the evidence actually supports, is a narrower and more uncomfortable one, that the murder of Alessandro de' Medici sits at the intersection of a documented act. A nobleman did lure his cousin to a private chamber and kill him with a hired blade, and an almost entirely undocumented set of motives, pressures, and possible collaborators that the surviving sources simply do not allow us to reconstruct with confidence. We know how he died. We are considerably less certain that we know why, or whether the hand that held the sword was truly acting alone. So the palace chamber falls quiet again, as it must have on that January night once the struggle finally ended. The candle burned low, the carpet drawn over what remained, the door easing shut behind a man riding hard for the city gates. Somewhere in that darkness, a true account of what was planned, by whom, and to what end, either never existed in any form we could recover, or existed once and was deliberately allowed to die with the men who might have told it. Was Alessandro de' Medici brought down by one cousin's private ambition dressed in the language of liberty? Or by something larger, moving quietly behind him, that simply found Lorenzino's dagger convenient? The palace has long since changed hands, the carpet is long gone, and the only voices left to answer are the ones history recorded from men who each had every reason to shape the story to their own advantage. What, we might still ask, really happened in that room? And who, if anyone, was standing just beyond the candlelight, waiting to see how it would end?